So, welcome everyone to this webinar of the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care. I'm Adelina Comas-Herrera, the director of the observatory, and together with NAS, we're organizing webinars and we're delighted to host this one today. I'm going to quickly share my screen to introduce the observatory, which some of you are already quite familiar with, but there's always new people. And basically, the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care is a platform for cross-national learning to improve and strengthen care systems and is part of the International Long-Term Care Policy Network. The aim is to identify key shared challenges, showcase how different countries and localities are addressing them, share research evidence, and facilitate collaborations. And I have to say today's webinar is a perfect example of the kind of thing we're hoping to do. It is open to everyone who has an interest in long-term care. And the way it works is that it's basically based on people's willingness to share their work and knowledge and experiences. So we have our own GOLTC publications. These include some country long-term care system profiles. We have a series of blogs, and we're also publishing methods and topic guides. The real motor of the observatory are the interest groups. We now have over 20. And the interest groups basically choose a topic and organize a series of webinars around that topic. And they can also share relevant publications and resources. Each interest group has its own web page where they can share. And when you join the observatory, you can sign up to any of the interest groups or ask to join later on. We're gradually developing a database that is covering, at this stage, about 560 experts on long-term care. So we know about your countries, topics, methods, interests. We are also developing a database of publications on long-term care, of research projects, and a growing number now of videos of webinars. In terms of our next events, the next week we have a webinar from the continent's care in long-term care interest group, so a very different topic, but also incredibly important in long-term care systems. That's on the 14th of May. We then have a webinar on aging out of place, rethinking aging, place and policy in times of change. That's on the 19th of May. That's also a new interest group. We have a webinar of the quasi-experimental methods interest group, which is on estimating the cost of informal care using some very interesting techniques. And we will have one on community health interventions through music engagement for perinatal mental health. We have a few more that we will let you know about soon, and we will also be sharing our next newsletter on Monday with quite a few interesting news and also events by others. So with that, I'd like to finish and just introduce you to Isabel Schutz, who's going to tell you a little bit about the interest group.
Thanks, Adelina. So just to say a few words about the interest group on migration, mobility and care workers. So the aims of the group really are to bring together those of us carrying out research and those of us working in policy and practice at the intersections really of long-term care and migration, principally long-term care policy and immigration policies, but not exclusively immigration policies, knowing that a wide range of social and public policies can have implications for international migration and the mobility of the care workforce, both across borders and within nation-state borders. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome our speakers today, who are going to be presenting their research. This is the second of the group's webinars, and we would be delighted if those of you joining us today have suggestions for other webinars. You may wish to present your own work. It's not exclusively research-based. We want very much to facilitate exchange of ideas, debates and so on amongst group members working across the research and policy fields. So if you have suggestions, please do get in touch with myself. My details are on the group's webpage. and we'd be delighted to hear from you. So just to welcome our speakers today, who will be presenting their work on the politics of live-in care migration, a comparative study of Taiwan, Austria and Germany. I'm delighted to introduce Simone Lieber, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. Also, Lifang Liang, who is Associate Professor in Sociology at the National Donghua University, Taiwan. August Osterli, who's Professor of Social Policy at the University of Vienna in Austria, and Mi-Hyung Yun, who is a doctoral researcher in the University of Bremen in Germany. So a terrific team in terms of, I know many of your work, many of you have been working in the field for a number of years, a terrific team, and I'm really excited and interested to be hearing your talk. So I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much as well for the kind introduction. I will start with the presentation and share the screen. Yeah, so again, thanks very much. We are very happy to have the opportunity to present our ongoing research here. And yeah, this is the collaborative work of researchers from Taiwan, Austria, and Germany, South Korea. So Mi-Hyung is located in both. Mi-Hyung and I are located or connected to the Global Collaborative Research Center, Global Dynamics of Social Policy in Bremen, and August and Lifang we know from conferences, and we are very happy that we brought together our perspectives and present ongoing work. I will present and my co-authors will support me and may correct me in the discussion, but to keep it short, I will start. And so far, the status of what we present is that we have developed a conference paper based on our country experiences. But after the session here, we plan to finalize the work and submit our paper to a journal. And therefore, of course, your comments are very, very welcome. The field we want to look into is familiar to you. I'm sure of that. It is live-in migrant care work. So this is a particular field or sector of care work that we understand as care work by foreign workers within the household of a person in need of care. And the care workers are usually expected to provide round-the-clock support. And of course, as you know, the sector is often associated with a high risk of precarious working conditions and also precarious quality of care. And if you look at the three countries we seek to compare, you see that it is interesting that there are quite a few similarities, although of course they differ in terms of the welfare state context a lot and also in terms of the regional cultural contexts. Just a few facts and figures, we don't have to go into the details there, but what characterizes all three countries is really that the feminist tradition is very present in all countries. So the overall majority, you see here the figures, 90% in Taiwan, 80%, 85% in Austria, and 86% in Germany of the people in need of care are cared for at home, and the overall majority alone by their family members. And you also see that the phenomenon of live-in migrant care workers is important in numbers, and also in all three countries brokerage agencies, so entrepreneurial actors who have discovered a business field in this market are very present. And what we plan to do for the rest of the time, to explain what research gaps we want to address, and of course the research questions of our analysis. This is, as I've said before, it's not so much an own empirical project. It is more, we bring together our perspectives, our research knowledge, and our understandings in order to pursue such a comparison. I will explain which conceptual framework we use in the next step. That is a framework we call policy responses to live in migrant care. And then I go through the analytical part and explain what are different policy responses to live in migrant care in the 3 countries, and look at differences and similarities, and at actors' interests behind these policy responses. And then we try to sum up and conclude for the discussion. In the field of live-in migrant care work, there is, of course, already a lot going on. It is well researched. Many persons also here in the stream have done important work on that. The main interest so far has been on the integration of migration, labor market, and gender regimes, for example, also at the gendered consequences and intersectional interdependencies in the field, the working conditions of domestic workers, also the role of brokerage and employment agencies as intermediaries is well studied. And there's also growing interest in migrant workers' empowerment and self-organization. What has been less in focus, as we try to argue, is how really governments respond to this phenomenon. So what are different policies really addressing this phenomenon? What are different, as we call it, policy responses or non-responses that countries find? And what are the political drivers and stakeholders behind these responses? And this is what we call the politics of live-in migrant care. And this is what we want to dive into a bit more deeply. And what is also not so common so far is cross-continental comparison, and therefore our approach seeks to compare developments in Europe and East Asia. What are our research questions? We ask, what are the policy responses to live-in migrant care work, and what are the obstacles to improving working conditions and labor rights of live-in migrant care workers in the 3 countries? And a bit more detailed, we look at we proceed in 2 steps. How do policy responses in the field differ in the 3 countries, and who are the key actors, and what are their roles in particular in constructing or opposing the improvement of working conditions and labor rights of these workers? This is what we seek to understand. And the basis, empirical basis, is a comprehensive literature and document analysis, and also related to Myong's dissertation. There have also been, she has carried out some complementary expert interviews in Taiwan. Now I come to the conceptual framework. For this, we use our analysis is based on the work Franka von Horen has already carried out in 2011. She has distinguished policy responses in the care migration field in 2 different, from 3 different perspectives. Direct policy responses at the national level. So, for example, really if a government regulates this sector, this market. Then indirect policy development at the national level. These are policies, for example, in the long-term care system or long-term care insurance, which are not directly targeted on live-in migrant care workers, but nevertheless influence how the sector evolves and develops. And finally, indirect policy developments at the international level. So, for example, for Germany and Austria, of course, the EU context and what is the EU labor market is very relevant for the phenomenon. And these policies, according to Van Horen, can have encouraging and discouraging effects. So, for example, unregulated cash benefits, cash for care benefits in the long-term care insurance system, of course, can be used to finance the migrant care workers, and this has an encouraging effect, or restrictive immigration legislation can, of course, discourage the field or the sector. In our approach, we have added 2 additional layers in the analysis. We also look for policies that lead to improvement or deterioration in the working conditions. So, for example, the regulation or exception from working time restrictions. And finally, also, of course, non-responses are possible. And we will see this is, for example, in Germany, the case where really at the national level, nothing has happened and everybody is waiting for really the government to address what has happened in the field via regulation. So that's the conceptual framework. Now I dive a little bit into the analysis and the comparison of the 3 countries. I start with Taiwan. We observe what we call insufficient labor protection within a government-controlled market. So in Taiwan, the governments have addressed the field with explicit direct national regulation. In the beginning of the 1990s, there was the Employment Services Act with the aim of managing and controlling migrant flow, and also the legalization and regulation of migrant workers' employment was introduced, and that's based on a guest worker system. However, the living care workers are not covered by the Labor Standards Act. So there are exemptions from, for example, working time and other working conditions. Please, Li Fang can go into details later. And this therefore, does not, though there was a very critical discussion on the labor rights and the labor conditions. And also later in the development of the policies, there were discussions on the improvement of policies. There were minor steps. For example, a direct hiring option was introduced in 2008. So there were limited effects on the working conditions and the protection of the labor rights that were introduced stepwise later in the process. In Austria, it is interesting to observe that the sector did not start by government action, but it started more evolved from informal arrangement and a huge amount of undeclared labor. But then it is remarkable that in 2007, via the Home Care Act, an encompassing national direct policy response was introduced, and the model that was used was mainly based on the self-employment of live-in migrant care workers. So this regularization and this policy improved legal security and also the social security of the workers. But nevertheless, the effects on the migrants' working conditions have remained quite limited. And also since then, since 2007, to make it short, further reform steps remained rather small. And also rather short, the story is summarized in Germany. As of March or as of now, currently no national direct policy response has been adopted. There are a lot of discussions going on. What is interesting, at the end of 2004, there was a recommendation of an interministerial working group that recommended a model program that should introduce a regulation based on an employer-employee model for a legally secure live-in arrangement. And that's quite an interesting approach, because that really means that live-in migrant care workers should be employed under normal, regular working conditions by the family. But so far, this is only a recommendation for a model program, so very soft. And it remains to be seen what will happen in the future with that. So for a moment, I come to an interim summary or conclusion as regards the different policy responses or differences and similarities. So what is interesting, or what we try to argue is interesting, that at least at first sight, the policy responses to live-in care are more similar in Taiwan, in Austria, and in Austria than in Austria and Germany. That is because we observe that while live-in care is generally regulated in Taiwan and Austria, a direct national policy response in Germany is still lacking. However, we also try to argue that as regards the working rights or labor standards, we are interested in a neglect of those is visible or is common to all the three cases. And in a next step in our study, we look at what are the actor constellations and the politics behind this quite interesting results. So despite the different conditions, we really see that in terms of working conditions, there's a neglect visible throughout or across the cases. Then in the paper, we try to look a bit behind the political constellations. Of course, I can only shortly give a few impressions, but we are very interested, of course, to explain more of that in the discussion. In Taiwan, we observe what we called power contestation among the stakeholders. After the introduction of the Employment Services Act in the 1990s, different actors engaged in the further regulation of the field, especially private recruitment agencies, play a crucial role in Taiwan for facilitating the flow of migrant care labor. And of course, they are making also significant profits from the recruitment, training, and placement of the workers. On the other hand, NGOs in Taiwan are also very active in the field, and they strive for the urgent need to abandon the private brokerage system to provide better protection for the migrant workers. There are also 3 labor unions that are organized by live-in migrant care workers. However, there are also conflicts, which we try to describe and analyze a bit more in the papers, between the different NGOs advocating for the live-in migrant care workers on the one hand, and NGOs who represent family carers, the elderly, and the disabled. So their interests are not always aligned, and this makes it more difficult to achieve political success, and therefore, despite considerable civil society activism, the goal of enacting a domestic workers' protection law and the goal of including live-in migrant care workers into the formal care system, which is an important goal of the NGOs, has not been achieved. In Austria, it is very interesting to look into what made the very far-reaching reform of 2007 possible. And we argue that it was a very specific window of opportunity linked to the national elections in 2006, which made this possible. And in this context, the irregular use of this form of care was heavily scandalized in the media, and a consensus was reached among the key political actors that a regularization was urgently needed. This regularization also changed the landscape of actors. And a new field of private and also non-profit organizations acting as brokers and intermediaries developed. As far as I see, the non-profit actors, as well as the Chamber of Labor, that is the mandatory representative of employees in Austria, also became stronger voices in demanding labor rights for live-in migrant care workers, and also a self-organized, non-partisan association of care workers, the so-called IG24, has developed. However, despite these activities, policy proposals and demand for systematic improvements in the working conditions and establishment of labor rights have not yet been taken up by the government. And so, also here the goal of improvement could not really be achieved. In Germany, finally, the analysis argues that such a political window of opportunity as in Austria has not materialized yet. It is interesting to observe that to date there are really no actors or policy entrepreneurs, to use Kingdom's term, in Germany really willing to or able to push such a direct national policy response onto the parliamentary agenda and into the legislative process. Interestingly, in Germany, it is above all some of the brokerage agencies that are really active in lobbying for regulation. And those are those agencies who want to go the Austrian way. So they lobby to follow the Austrian path of regulation. This leads me to the conclusion. What we try to argue is that policy responses to live-in care are at first sight, quite similar in Austria and Taiwan. And it is interesting that they are quite dissimilar in Austria and Germany, despite similar welfare states and similar conditions. However, despite variations in regulations and the actor constellations we describe, it is also astonishing that a neglect of workers' rights is common across all the three cases. And we argue that these cases represent different paths of neglecting workers' rights. And in a final step, we try to discuss driving factors for this, common to all the three countries. What is maybe common is that the high attractiveness of the 24/7 arrangements and also the high cost of the regular employment employee model may contribute to understanding the pattern. Also, of course, that there has a very attractive business field for brokerage agencies evolved who oppose encompassing labor standards. In all the three countries, quite a lot of priority is given to the to covering the care needs and assessing care labor shortages, as opposed to prioritizing the labor rights of the workers. And finally, the relational nature of care work may also be part of the puzzle or the story to see why, despite all the differences, the final outcome or what happens on the ground for the workers and in the families in such constellations may not look so much different after all. Now we are very happy about your comments and discussing further what or how you look onto these developments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Simona, and all of you for a fantastic presentation, which I certainly have got lots of thoughts and questions in my mind. Should we take, if anyone would like to either put their question in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll take questions or reflections indeed. Eva?
Yes, maybe I can start with a very general question or general theoretical question, actually, from the framework done. I mean that you use or reuse by Franka van Horen. I was asking myself, looking at this framework, Simone and the other authors. There are different types of policy responses on national and international level. And I ask myself why on international level we identify only indirect policy responses. So what about 189 Convention on Domestic Workers? So it's rather a question, not, yes, question to you as experts in policy, international policy, because these discussions on international regulations of transnational labor markets are so important. So first of all, yes, is this framework maybe outdated, or do you, yes, how do you apply it, and could you relate to that?
Yeah, maybe I start, if I may. I think we have defined it quite narrowly, the direct response. Or at least I understood it in a way that it is only a direct response if it really addresses live-in migrant care, this really specific phenomenon. Therefore, direct regulation that really names live-in migrant care, for example, at the EU level, and that's what we thought about, is not yet present. It's in the debate, but it hasn't happened yet. We don't have a EU regulation on that. And for the ILO and so on discussions, we have thought more about the general regulation that has more indirect influence on the field.
But ILO on domestic workers, it's exactly the convention on this sector, isn't it?
Yeah, you are right. Maybe we should add this. We are of course aware of the regulation and of course of the relevance of that. We have so far only classified it more to the indirect influence.
So I have lots of questions. Thank you for really interesting presentation and one where you sort of really provided a kind of historical context to all of this and what has and what hasn't really changed since some of the reforms that we saw in previous years. And I was just wondering, in terms of regulation, you talked about the limits in Austria to workers' rights and the sort of focus being much more on care coverage and essentially addressing needs. And I wondered what sort of rights there have been demands around, and to what extent. I focus on Austria because you talked about rights in relation to Austria explicitly in your conclusions, but of course that is relevant to the other country cases. And I suppose what sort of rights might be leveraged for those groups of care workers, whether that's to do with pay, hours of work, who they're employed, what sort of employment relationship they have, whether that's directly with the person they care for, or whether there is some sort of intermediary agency. So I just wondered if you could expand a bit around what sorts of contestations really there have been around the sort of rights that might improve the working lives of these care workers.
Shall I start with the Austrian case? So thank you. Probably I just start. So in the presentation, Simone has emphasized the self-employment mode in the Austrian situation. I probably should add at this point that the respective law also offers a second option, which is a traditional employer-employee option. So that's in the law. And again, with two options, employment via the agency or employment via the user or a family member. This option is very, very rarely taken up. So in reality, it's the self-employment option. But it might also be, or it is interesting to also look at this employer-employee option in Austria in terms of the regulations. So even there, you have some specific regulations, in particular in terms of work time. So there is a work time regulation in Austria for domestic workers, differentiating between live-in and live-out domestic workers. And again, this legal act has other specific regulations for migrant live-in care workers in terms of the hours of work. So the regulation is you can have a period of a maximum up to 2 weeks, I think, and for a maximum of 128 hours of work during these 2 weeks if someone would go for an employer-employee relationship. But there would be minimum wages as well in both options, whether you are employed by an agency. There is a different minimum wage compared to a situation where you would be employed by the user, by a family member, for example. But the reality is self-employment. The vast majority is self-employment. And what was mentioned in the presentation, so self-employment provides legal security. It provides social security coverage. That's very important. There are some differences, again, to an employer-employee relationship, in particular in terms of unemployment. So unemployment or unemployment insurance for the self-employed in Austria is voluntary. So you can opt into voluntary unemployment insurance in Austria. But it's a small proportion who is actually doing that, and even more so among migrant care workers. There are also some specific issues in healthcare. For example, there are different co-payment arrangements, more extended co-payments if you are a self-employed person. But the large variation comes with labor rights. So there is no minimum pay, for example. It's sick leave, for example, is very different. There is specific arrangements on sick payments, but again, these differ from an employer-employee relationship. So in terms of labor rights, these are rather limited within the self-employment mode. And that's rarely touched upon. I mean, there are these actors I've mentioned, or Simone has mentioned, the Chamber of Labor, for example, or this initiative IG24 that became quite active in recent years and fighting for regular employer-employee relationships. But then you have the other actors, and other actors, if you look at their statements, they are largely ignoring the issue of working rates. They might address issues of quality assurance, but worker rights are largely ignored. They are not even touched upon in many of the respective documents. And that's why we addressed it as kind of labor rights are sidelined. There are some actors very active, but it's not having a major impact so far on the policymaking processes or the changes that do take place, the adjustments. So the call is mostly for more subsidization, and one of the recent issues is opening up the option for non-EU member states, so facilitate an entry for migrant care workers from beyond the European Union. So it's kind of strengthening the existing model rather than strengthening labor rights.
Thank you so much. Blair, you.
Representing here Eurocarers, which is a network of organizations working with and for informal carers. And we are currently working on the issue of migrant care internally, with having in mind the publication of a position paper and a campaign in October. What concerns us as informal carers, who are often the employers of migrant carers, be they living or not living, is a great deal of concern regarding not only the quality, the management of such care, and the fact that very often it is not chosen, but taken up as the only option available for ensuring personalized care for a loved one and maintaining one's participation on the labor market. But this is not something that informal carers are mostly happy about, especially being aware of the conditions that are often applied. So we try to think both at taking all the aspects of the situation from the angle of, from the point of view of informal carers, including worker rights, but also their well-being and health, which is a prerequisite to quality, but also support to informal carers in their roles as employer, which can be a burden and a difficulty. We've been playing with different kind of thinking of what could be the solution. And we are always confronted with this conundrum of the financial part of it. The fact that around the clock care is, if correctly paid and monitored, is very expensive, and that money is scarce, public money is scarce, and at the same time should be available not only for the well-off families. And we were thinking that if we move towards something that is more declared, that brings more return in terms of tax and social contribution, it might be a way to finance a more healthy, let's say, and qualitative system. And I just wanted to ask, but that's a difficult question, if you came across some positive example that we could build on to try to advocate for this kind of approaches.
If I may start, of course, it's a very difficult question to have a good solution how really to regulate this field and how to do it. And in Germany, I think it's now going in a direction which is quite interesting, but it's not it hasn't been implemented, and therefore it's of course not a good practice model. But I think the only way I see it is to have really regular employment, but have it embedded into a mixed care arrangement. So to really try, if you link it to a kind of public funding, for example, from the long-term insurance scheme, like it is also the case in Austria, there are public funds going into the arrangements, then to have a kind of way to link this to certain quality standards and try to, if you finance it publicly, then try to do this under certain conditions, that there are working conditions, that there's a control in the arrangement, there's a counseling in the arrangement, that there are other services in the arrangements, and so on. But of course, this is very controversial, and others would say if we use public money to support such a nevertheless precarious arrangement, I can fully understand it. So I think it's it's a very difficult question.
I think I can continue. Yeah, but I also agree with Simone. It's a very difficult questions. Just like Simone mentioned in the presentation, I think for Taiwan, because the living migrant care workers, they are not entitled to the labor standards aids. And so right now, lots of NGOs, we try to argue that we need to abandon the employment employment we need to abandon the live-in model. So it means that the migrant workers should be hired by for example care facilities or the formal care providers. On one hand, this kind of employment model maybe can improve their working conditions and labor rights. And on the other hand, we also argue that this kind of employment model also can improve the quality of care, because compared to the case in Germany in Austria, actually for the employers of living migrant workers, they are also always about they always worry about the quality of care, because we only according to the government regulations, for migrant living care workers, they only need to receive 96 hours for trainings in their home countries, and all the trainings is not necessarily related to care work itself. And many workers say they go through the trainings for Mandarin class, or how to use the household equipments, and so on. So we also argue that if the migrant care workers can hire by the formal care providers or the care facilities, it's not only can improve their working rights and also their well-being and health condition, and at the same time, I think the formal care provider, they also can kind of monitor, although I don't really like the term monitor, but I think they also can monitor the quality of care. It's also better for the individual families.
Yeah, actually, hi, Halldór here. I was wondering, do you have any shouldn't say any answers about what was the initiative for setting the regulation or the policies where it was put in place? I mean, I think there is a discussion in the European Union about it, as you have been talking about, but what was the initiative? What's the main purpose for the regulation when Taiwan was putting in this policy actions on their side?
I think the question was more on Taiwan. So, I mean, I can answer for Austria. So in the Austrian case, I mean, long-term care or live-in migrant care work started to emerge from the second half of the 1990s and became more prominent in the early 2000s. But it was a gray economy of care, so it was outside regulations. But partly it was it was well known, and you could have a GP telling you there is this option, there is 24-hour care. However, you can find a solution for your individual situation. But it was outside labor law, outside social law. So, and at some point it became a major political issue in 2006. So on the one hand, NGOs were pushing for regulating for quite some time. In 2006, there were a couple of cases where insurance funds in Austria were suing for illegally employing care workers in their private households. This was taken up by the media, and in the summer of 2000, it really became a political issue, and not least because of national elections in that year, in the autumn of that year, there was huge pressure to do something about this. And even before the election, there was already quite a broad approach. Yes, we have to do something. And within a few months, there was the respective regulation that was very briefly introduced.
And yeah, so for the case in Taiwan, just like Simone mentioned in the presentation, so although we have the Employment Service Aid to regulate the flows of migrant workers, but compared to migrant workers working in the industrial sectors, migrant living workers working in the individual families, they are not entitled to the labor standard laws. And I think I also need to mention compared to the German or Austria case, because the public long-term care assistance in Taiwan has only developed in 2007. So, but the government opened the employments for migrant living care workers in 1992. So I think there's I tried to calculate. Yeah, because the government provide the option to individual families or earlier than the government started developing long-term care service and systems. So for many individual families, it's very convenient for us to think about, there's a options, and then we can use the employment of living migrant care workers to solve the care needs in the family.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to know, because I was just wondering about this in care options. Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question. So Eva, looks like you've got that last question.
So it's a question to Simone, because we did or do research in Germany. So it's a question on your empirical results, this one, Simone. When you analyze the silence or not responding policy or politics, let's say, in this case, you're talking about policy entrepreneur, yes? So what kind of actor or collective actor do you have on mind? Do you have other examples from other countries? I mean, actors who took on the role of policy entrepreneur in this sector. From my experience, it's very problematic in this sphere. As you mentioned in the Austrian case, it was just a window of opportunity, actually, yes, and not any dominant actor or yes, policy entrepreneur, as you call it.
I would have to briefly think about this. So, but I think that that's the current challenge. That I mean, there is this agenda, and there are some stakeholders very strongly trying to push the agenda, but often they do not really speak to each other. So there is very little exchange, and very separate agendas. Also, it's still often the case that we talk either about migrant care work, live-in migrant care work, 24-hour care work, or we talk about long-term care. So even there is a separation. I mean, on the ground, things are starting to come closer, and those intermediaries that have more interest in providing good quality of care as well, they try to combine live-in migrant care work with traditional home care arrangements in a way. But there is very little effort. I mean, one of the advantages, because there was a question about best practices, I don't see best practices, but improve practices that help improve things. And I think one of the advantages in the Austrian situation is we know the migrant care workers, we know the agencies, so that there actually would be room for regulation and to change things and to push the agenda. Even within the existing system, you could go for improvements. Yeah, not least because of the current, I mean, in Austria, for example, right before the COVID-19, there was a huge effort to rethink the way we are organizing and financing long-term care. The whole process was more or less stopped with COVID-19. But there was a huge political effort, for example, to think about long-term care and this challenge that we are facing, not least in demographic terms, in terms of staff shortages over the next 2 decades. And that could have been a context for also bringing in this live-in migrant care work.
I mean, in Germany, it was definitely agencies who got the voice, you know, and who became important actors, you know, being the voice of the sector, you know, and being heard. So they really got legitimized through pandemic. Yes.
But even these agencies and have different ideas. So some are definitely on the side of improving not just quality, but also improving working conditions. But there are other agencies that push the agenda for even further liberalization. We had even these responses. We need a more liberal market for migrant care work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Adelina, sorry, you were...
Yeah, no, I think we'll need to end it here because it's already beyond the time, but it has been a fascinating webinar, really a lot of food for thought, also thinking what are other countries doing as well. And I know my colleague Catherine Hertenson is in the call and she's doing some work on live-in carers, and maybe we can also link you up so you can be in touch. Thank you also those of you who shared publications. We will upload them on the website. And thanks for a great webinar. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.